Welcome back to African Tale by Lonnie. Today we're hearing a story from Minnesota. The freezing rain of an unforgiving Minneapolis storm lashed against my face as I desperately clutched my unconscious son to my chest. My name is Clara, and at 32 years old, I never imagined I would be standing here completely homeless. My 5-year-old son, Noah, was burning up in my arms with a terrifying fever that made his small body tremble violently against my soaking wet shirt. I checked his temperature with my hand again, but his skin felt like burning coals against my frozen fingers. Only 10 minutes ago, the heavy front door of my childhood home had slammed shut in my face while my mother screamed from inside that I should never come back. I stood shivering at this dilapidated bus stop, praying for a miracle. But the last bus of the night just splashed dirty water onto us without stopping. The driver simply waved his hand to dismiss us because the vehicle was too full to take another passenger. I looked down at my son, who was gasping for air, and I felt my heart shatter into a million pieces. I felt my knees buckle under the weight of my absolute despair as I realized we were truly alone in this freezing nightmare. I was ready to run into the middle of the road to beg any stranger for help when a sleek black luxury car suddenly pulled over to the curb. The tinted window rolled down slowly to reveal a shocked face I had not seen in years. It was the patriarch of our family. My grandfather Edward looked at me with pure horror in his eyes as he shouted over the roar of the rain. "Clara, what are you doing here? Why is Noah looking like that?" Before we find out how my grandfather made them pay for this cruelty, please subscribe to our channel for more stories. 12 hours before the storm hit the city of Minneapolis, the tension inside my parents' house was already suffocating enough to crush my spirit. The atmosphere hung heavy in every hallway, like a poisonous fog that made simply breathing feel like an exhausting labor for me. As I moved through the shadows of my childhood home, I found myself ruminating with a heavy heart on how drastically and painfully my life had collapsed over the last few turbulent years since my divorce 3 years ago. I had fought tooth and nail to keep my head above water as a single mother after my marriage ended. But losing my stable job 2 months ago was the final devastating blow that completely shattered my independence. That overwhelming financial catastrophe forced me to swallow every ounce of my pride and bring my son back to this place where I was clearly no longer looked upon as a daughter, but rather as a burdensome failure who had returned to beg. Although I dutifully handed over every single cent of my unemployment check to cover what my parents called living expenses, my status in this household was significantly lower than that of a hired servant. I woke up at 5 in the morning every single day to scrub the dirty floors and prepare a hot breakfast, while the rest of the household slept peacefully upstairs in their warm beds. The unfairness of the situation burned in my chest like acid because my sister Natalie was allowed to sleep until noon in the most comfortable guest suite on the 2nd floor without a care in the world. She never lifted a single finger to help with any household chores. Yet she was treated like royalty while I was constantly reminded of my failures and made to feel small in front of my own son. The atmosphere turned openly hostile mid-morning when my mother Patricia stormed into the bathroom while I was trying to bathe my son to lower his temperature. She began screaming aggressively about the cost of the water bill simply because I had used warm water to wash the grime and sweat off Noah's feverish body. It was infuriating to hear her lecture me about saving a few cents on electricity while she sat at the kitchen table casually browsing expensive online boutiques on her tablet. She had just purchased a designer handbag for Natalie without blinking an eye, but she made me feel like a thief for trying to keep my son clean and comfortable during his illness. I stood there silently, accepting her verbal abuse while wrapping Noah in a thin towel because defending myself would only lead to a threat of eviction, which was a terror I lived with every single hour. By the early afternoon, I noticed that Noah was not acting like his usual energetic self, and his cough was becoming a dry, hacking sound that echoed ominously through the quiet house. When I placed my hand against his forehead, I felt a terrifying heat radiating from his skin that sent a wave of panic crashing through my body and made my hands tremble. I immediately ran to my bedroom to frantically search through my wallet for enough cash to buy children's fever reducers from the pharmacy down the street. My heart sank into my stomach when I stared into the empty leather fold and remembered with a jolt of horror that I had given my mother my last $50 yesterday for groceries. The realization that I was completely penniless with a sick child in a house full of wealth made me feel a level of desperation I had never known before. I swallowed the painful lump of shame in my throat and forced my legs to carry me downstairs to find my mother sitting comfortably in the living room. She was flipping through a fashion magazine with a glass of iced tea on the table beside her, looking completely unbothered by the heavy atmosphere in the house. I approached her with trembling hands and asked her in a low voice if I could please borrow $25 because Noah was burning up and needed medication immediately. I expected at least a flicker of grandmotherly concern for her grandson, or perhaps a moment of sympathy for her own daughter's desperate situation. She didn't even look up from her magazine when she delivered her crushing response with a voice devoid of any warmth or affection. "You lost your job, not your brain, Clara. Stop mooching off us." Her cruel words felt like a physical slap to my face that left me stunned and breathless in the center of the living room while she turned another glossy page. I retreated to the hallway to call my best friend Emma because I felt like I was going to explode from the isolation and needed to hear a kind voice. Emma listened to me cry and offered comforting words, but she lived across the country and could not offer the immediate financial help I desperately needed right now. While I was still on the phone wiping away tears, Natalie came sauntering down the stairs, looking refreshed and happy from her long sleep. Instead of asking about her sick nephew, she laughed cruelly and accused me of using a sick child as an excuse to get out of cooking dinner for the family. As the afternoon light began to fade into a gloomy evening, I realized that the storm brewing outside was nothing compared to the hatred swirling inside these walls. The hopelessness of my situation washed over me as I hung up the phone and prepared to face a night of terror without any resources to help my suffering child. At 2 a.m., a terrifying sound woke me from my restless sleep in the damp basement that had become our temporary prison. It was a guttural gasping noise that sounded like someone was drowning in shallow water, and it instantly triggered every maternal alarm bell in my exhausted mind. I scrambled out of my thin blankets and rushed to the makeshift cot where my son was sleeping, only to find a scene that will haunt my nightmares for the rest of my life. Noah was no longer just feverish, but was now convulsing in the grip of a violent seizure that caused his small limbs to jerk uncontrollably against the mattress. I placed my trembling hand against his forehead and pulled it back immediately because his skin was radiating a terrifying heat that felt unnatural and dangerous. The digital thermometer I jammed under his arm beeped aggressively within seconds to confirm my worst fears as the red numbers flashed a life-threatening 40 degrees Celsius. Panic clawed at my throat as I realized that the cold, damp air of the basement, combined with his weakened immune system, had pushed his condition into a critical emergency. I knew immediately that I could not wait for a taxi because I had absolutely no money left in my wallet, and the storm raging outside was severe enough to delay any ride-share service for an eternity. I scooped Noah up into my arms without bothering to put on my shoes and sprinted up the wooden stairs that led to the main floor of the house. The hallway was dark and silent, but the sound of thunder crashing against the roof matched the frantic pounding of my heart as I ran toward the master bedroom. I banged my fist against the solid oak door with enough force to bruise my knuckles because politeness was no longer an option when my son's life hung in the balance. I heard grumbling from inside before the door was yanked open to reveal my father, Robert, who looked down at me with an expression of intense irritation rather than concern. I did not give him a moment to scold me for the noise as I thrust my shaking child toward him and begged for his help with tears streaming down my face. "Dad, please, Noah is seizing. We need the car." I expected him to rush for his keys, or at least show a flicker of fear for his only grandson, but he simply leaned against the doorframe and rubbed his tired eyes. He looked past my trembling form to glance out the hallway window where the rain was coming down in torrential sheets that battered the glass. He turned his gaze back to me with a look of cold calculation that made my blood run cold as he delivered his refusal. "Are you crazy? I just detailed the interior. I'm not letting a sick kid vomit inside my new car. Call a taxi." I stared at him in paralyzed shock, as if he had just spoken in a foreign language, because I could not comprehend how a grandfather could prioritize leather upholstery over a dying child. Before I could scream at him, the commotion drew the rest of the household out of their rooms like angry specters. My mother appeared in her silk robe, looking annoyed, while Natalie stepped out of her room with a sleep mask pushed up on her forehead. Instead of rushing to help her nephew, who was still twitching in my arms, Natalie let out an exaggerated sigh of frustration and leaned against the wall. She complained loudly that she had an important beauty appointment in the morning, and that my drama was ruining her sleep schedule. My mother immediately sided with her favorite daughter and began scolding me for creating chaos in the middle of the night instead of handling my problems quietly like an adult. Something inside me snapped violently at that moment and shattered the fear that had kept me silent and submissive for the last 2 months. I screamed at them with a voice I didn't recognize and accused them of being heartless monsters who cared more about their possessions than their own flesh and blood. My accusation struck a nerve because my father's face turned a deep shade of crimson red, and his irritation transformed into a blinding rage. He did not tolerate being spoken to with disrespect in the house he owned, and he decided in that split second that he was done with my presence. He pushed past me and marched down the hall to the closet where I kept my few belongings and grabbed the handle of my battered suitcase. He dragged the heavy bag to the front door with a surprising amount of strength while I chased after him, screaming for him to stop. He threw the door open to the howling wind and rain before he hurled my suitcase out into the muddy darkness of the front yard. I stood frozen in the open doorway, clutching Noah tightly to my chest as the freezing wind whipped rain into the hallway and soaked the expensive rug. My mother walked up beside my father and looked at me with eyes that were devoid of any maternal love or sympathy. She crossed her arms over her chest and looked at me with the same disdain one might show a strayed dog that had wandered onto the porch. "You should be grateful you can stay in this house. Don't cause any more trouble. Now get out." The heavy wooden door slammed shut in my face with a finality that echoed in my bones, and the sound of the deadbolt sliding into place severed the last tie I had to this family. I was left standing on the porch in my pajamas with no shoes and a dying child in my arms while the storm swallowed us whole. I looked down at Noah's pale face and knew that I had to keep moving if I wanted to save him. So, I stepped off the porch and began running toward the bus stop through the blinding rain. 30 minutes after leaving the bus stop, the silence inside the luxury car was heavy. It was not the peaceful silence of safety, but rather a thick and suffocating tension that filled the space between the plush leather seats as the vehicle tore through the rain-slicked streets. My grandfather Edward sat beside me with a face that looked like it had been carved from gray stone while he stared down at the small and fragile form of his great-grandson. He had immediately ordered his private driver to disregard all speed limits and get us to the most exclusive private medical facility in the city because he could see that Noah was fading fast. I watched my grandfather carefully wrap his expensive cashmere coat around Noah's shivering body, and for the first time in years, I saw genuine fear in the eyes of the man who controlled a business empire. The warmth of the car's heating system began to thaw my frozen limbs, but the ice in my heart remained as I wondered if we had been rescued too late to save my son. When the car screeched to a halt at the emergency entrance of Lakewood Private Medical Center, a team of medical professionals was already waiting for us with a gurney because my grandfather had called ahead. They whisked Noah away into a private trauma room with a speed and efficiency that was light years away from the crowded public clinics I was used to attending. I was ushered into a private waiting suite that looked more like a hotel lobby than a hospital room, but I could not sit down on the velvet sofas. I paced back and forth across the marble floor for what felt like an eternity until the head pediatrician finally emerged with a grim expression on his face. He informed us that they had managed to stabilize Noah's temperature and stop the seizures, but the underlying diagnosis was severe acute pneumonia aggravated by prolonged exposure to damp conditions. The doctor hesitated for a moment before adding in a low voice that Noah also showed significant signs of chronic malnutrition, which had severely weakened his immune system against the infection. Hearing the word malnutrition caused my grandfather to stagger back as if he had been physically struck in the chest by an invisible attacker. He thanked the doctor quietly and waited for the door to close before he turned his piercing gaze toward me. I shrank back against the wall because I had never seen such a mixture of heartbreak and confusion in his eyes before this moment. He walked over to the window and looked out at the city lights for a long moment before asking me why I had allowed his great-grandson to live in squalor. He told me that he had provided enough resources to ensure that we lived a life of comfort, and he could not understand why Noah looked like a child from a famine-stricken country. He turned around to face me fully, and his voice trembled with a suppressed rage that I initially thought was directed at me. I sent Robert a supplemental credit card for you 3 years ago. Why didn't you use it? I stared at him in complete confusion because his words made absolutely no sense to me in the context of my reality. I had spent the last few years scraping together pennies and working double shifts at a diner just to keep a roof over our heads. What card? I never received anything. I've been working 2 shifts just to pay Mom for rent. The revelation hung in the air between us like a suspended guillotine blade as the pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place for him. My grandfather looked at me with wide eyes as he processed the fact that I had been paying rent to live in his house while his son stole the money meant for me. His face went deadly pale, and he gripped the back of a leather chair so hard that his knuckles turned completely white. The realization that his own son and daughter-in-law had not only stolen from him, but had actively starved their own grandson for profit unleashed a fury in him that was terrifying to behold. He did not scream or shout, but instead pulled his phone from his pocket with a deadly calm that promised retribution. He dialed a number that I knew he only used for extreme emergencies and waited for the line to connect. "Collins, wake up. I need a full forensic audit of Robert's account started tonight. I want every single transaction from the last 5 years scrutinized before sunrise." He hung up the phone and looked at me with a fierce protectiveness that finally made me feel safe. He promised me that by the time the sun came up, the people who did this to us would regret the day they were born. I finally collapsed onto the sofa and wept, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being believed. By dawn, the rain had stopped, but a different kind of storm was brewing inside the private medical suite where my grandfather and I had spent the entire night keeping vigil over Noah. The golden light of the morning sun filtered through the high windows and illuminated the exhaustion etched into my grandfather Edward's face as he sat in a leather armchair like a statue of judgment waiting for the gavel to fall. I sat beside Noah's bed holding his small hand while listening to the rhythmic beeping of the monitors that assured me he was finally stable and sleeping peacefully after the trauma of the night. The silence in the room was broken promptly at 7 o'clock when the heavy door swung open to reveal Mr. Collins, my grandfather's personal attorney and most trusted advisor, who entered the room carrying a thick leather briefcase. Mr. Collins looked impeccable in his charcoal suit despite the early hour, and the gravity of his expression told us immediately that the contents of his investigation were damning. He did not waste time with pleasantries as he walked over to the mahogany conference table in the corner of the suite and began laying out stacks of documents with precise and professional movements. My grandfather stood up slowly and beckoned for me to join them at the table because he wanted me to see the full extent of the betrayal with my own eyes. Mr. Collins opened the first file, which contained photocopies of monthly checks that had been issued from my grandfather's personal trust account over the last 3 years. I gasped audibly when I saw the amount printed clearly on the center of each check because $6,000 was a fortune that could have changed our lives completely. My eyes scanned the endorsement line on the back of the checks, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me when I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was a crude attempt at my own signature, but the distinctive loop of the letters belonged unmistakably to my father. I realized with horror that for 3 years my father had been intercepting the mail and forging my signature to steal the money that was meant to keep his grandson safe and fed. I had been scrubbing their floors and begging for $25 for medicine while they were cashing $6,000 a month in my name. The sheer magnitude of the theft made my knees weak because I calculated that they had stolen nearly $216,000 while watching me struggle to buy groceries. My grandfather picked up one of the copies and his hand shook violently as he stared at the evidence of his son's criminal behavior. He looked at Mr. Collins with burning eyes and demanded to know where such a vast sum of money had gone since the house was falling into disrepair and the refrigerator was often empty. Mr. Collins pulled out a second stack of papers which were detailed bank statements highlighting the flow of funds from my father's account to various vendors. "Look at these transactions, sir. The money wasn't used for the child. It went to online casinos and luxury boutiques." I leaned over to look at the highlighted rows and felt sick to my stomach as I saw thousands of dollars wasted on gambling websites under my father's name. There were also endless charges for high-end clothing stores and beauty salons that corresponded perfectly with the designer items my mother and Natalie flaunted daily. They had been wearing my son's health and eating my son's future while treating us like parasites who deserved to starve in their basement. The cruelty was so calculated and absolute that it was almost impossible to comprehend how people who claimed to be family could be so monstrous. Mr. Collins then delivered the final blow when he pulled out the property deed for the house where my parents lived and placed it on top of the pile. He explained that the property was actually held by one of my grandfather's holding companies, and my parents were merely guests who were allowed to live there rent-free as a favor. The irony that they had evicted me from a home they did not even own was the spark that finally ignited my grandfather's explosive temper. He realized that they had used his generosity as a weapon to abuse the very people he was trying to protect. Grandfather Edward grabbed the heavy file of evidence and slammed it down onto the table with a force that made the glass water pitcher rattle against its tray. His face was a mask of cold fury as he looked at the documents that proved his son was a thief and a liar who had nearly killed a child. He turned to Mr. Collins and delivered his instructions with a voice that was terrifyingly calm and left absolutely no room for negotiation or mercy. Draft the eviction notice immediately and prepare the lawsuit for embezzlement. I want them out by tonight. I watched my grandfather transform from a heartbroken old man into the ruthless business tycoon he was known to be, and I knew that the reckoning was coming. He walked over to the window and looked out at the city with hard eyes, while Mr. Collins immediately began typing on his laptop to draft the documents that would end my parents' reign of terror. That evening, the atmosphere in my parents' living room was festive. From the moment the heavy oak front door swung open under the force of my grandfather's private security team, the smell of expensive red wine and seared ribeye steak wafted out to meet us, creating a nauseating contrast to the sterile reality we had just left behind at the hospital. I stood silently behind Grandfather Edward, flanked by Mr. Collins and two imposing bodyguards, as we stepped into the foyer of the house that had been my prison only 24 hours ago. The scene before us was one of grotesque celebration as Dad sat at the head of the table raising a crystal wine glass while Mom and Natalie laughed up at something he had just said. They were not mourning the loss of their daughter or worrying about their sick grandson. They were celebrating their liberation from the burden of our presence. The laughter died instantly when they noticed the intrusion replaced by a silence so profound that I could hear the antique grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Dad dropped his silver fork onto his porcelain plate with a loud clatter that echoed through the room like a gunshot. His face drained of all color as he looked at his own father standing in the doorway like an avenging deity. His eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and dawning terror. Mom was the first to recover her composure, instinctively slipping into the role of the victim she had perfected over decades of manipulation. She rushed forward with her hands clasped against her chest, her face twisting into a mask of exaggerated worry that made my stomach turn. "Oh, Dad! Thank goodness you're here!" she exclaimed with a trembling voice, completely ignoring my presence in the shadows behind the security team. "We are absolutely distraught. Clara ran off last night with some man she met online. We tried to stop her. We begged her to think of Noah, but she just dragged that poor baby out into the storm." Her lie was so seamless in practice that for a second, I almost marveled at her audacity. She reached out to touch Grandfather Edward's arm, expecting him to comfort her, but he recoiled from her touch as if she were made of burning acid. He did not speak a single word to her. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a stack of high-resolution photographs we had taken at the hospital just hours ago. He threw them onto the dining table with a violent flick of his wrist, sending them sliding across the polished wood until they landed amidst the half-eaten steak dinners and wine glasses. The images of Noah lying in the hospital bed, hooked up to IVs with an oxygen mask over his small face, stared up at them in brutal high definition. Mom stopped mid-sob and stared at the photos, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Dad shrank back in his chair, unable to tear his eyes away from the proof of his negligence. Grandpa stepped forward into the light of the crystal chandelier, his voice low and vibrating with a lethal intensity that I had never heard before. "You left my great-grandson to die in the rain while you sat here eating steak. You hold the deed to nothing." The sentence hung in the air, shattering their delusion of ownership and control in a single breath. Dad stammered, trying to find a defense, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape route that didn't exist. Before he could utter a syllable, Mr. Collins stepped forward. The lawyer opened his briefcase and placed a formal eviction notice on the table right next to the heartbreaking photos of Noah. He spoke with a calm, professional detachment that made the news even more terrifying for them. "Mr. Robert, Mrs. Patricia, as of this moment, your permission to occupy this property has been revoked by the holding company. You are trespassing." Mr. Collins then pulled out a second document, this one thicker and bound in legal blue backing. "Furthermore, we have filed a civil lawsuit for the recovery of $350,000 in misappropriated funds alongside criminal charges for forgery and embezzlement against Mr. Robert. You have 3 days to return the full amount or we proceed with an immediate arrest warrant." The color that had drained from Dad's face was replaced by a sickly shade of gray. He looked at the legal documents and then at his father, realizing there would be no mercy this time. In a moment of pure cowardice that confirmed everything I hated about him, he turned on his wife. He pointed a shaking finger at Mom, his voice cracking with desperation. "It was her idea. Patricia told me to sign the checks. She said Clara didn't need the money because she was living here for free. I just did what she told me." Mom let out a screech of indignation, her worried grandmother mask falling away to reveal the vicious woman underneath. "You spineless coward, you were the one gambling it away online. Don't you dare pin this on me." As my parents turned on each other like cornered rats, Natalie let out a piercing wail from the other side of the table. She was staring at her phone screen in horror, tears streaming down her face, not for her nephew but for herself. "My cards are declining. I just tried to buy a flight to Bali and it says account frozen. Grandpa, you can't do this to me. I have nothing to do with their mess." Grandfather Edward looked at the three of them. His son betraying his wife, his daughter-in-law screaming profanities, and his granddaughter crying over a vacation while her nephew lay in a hospital bed. He looked at me, gave a curt nod, and we turned to leave, letting the chaos of their own making consume them. The alliance of cruelty that had made my life hell had finally crumbled under the weight of its own greed. The next morning, the reality of their actions arrived with the sunrise. It did not come with the gentle warmth of a new day, but rather with the screeching brakes of 3 large moving trucks that pulled into the driveway with military precision just as the sun began to crest over the horizon. The asset recovery team moved with the cold efficiency of executioners as they marched up the front walkway, ignoring my parents' frantic and incoherent protests to begin the systematic dismantling of their comfortable life. Dad stood in the foyer wearing his silk pajamas and watched in stunned silence as the antique mahogany furniture he loved to boast about to his friends was carried out the door because it technically belonged to the holding company. Mom tried to cling to a collection of expensive crystal vases she had bought with stolen money, but a stern officer informed her that she was only permitted to remove personal clothing and essential toiletries. The commotion naturally attracted the attention of the entire neighborhood, which had always viewed my family with a mixture of envy and suspicion regarding their sudden influx of wealth years ago. Mrs. Porter from across the street stood on her porch with a mug of coffee and watched with undisguised satisfaction as the facade of the perfect wealthy family crumbled before her eyes. The neighbors gathered in small clusters on the sidewalk, pointing at the eviction notice taped to the front door and whispering loudly enough for my parents to hear. About fraud and karma finally catching up to them. The public humiliation was a fate worse than death for a woman like my mother, who had built her entire identity around the perception of status and social superiority. The humiliation reached its absolute peak when Natalie attempted to sprint toward her convertible in the driveway, desperately clutching her purse, as if she could simply drive away from the consequences of her greed. She fumbled with her keys while screaming at the movers to get away from her property because she believed her birthday present was exempt from the seizure order. A large man with a clipboard stepped in front of the driver's side door and blocked her path with an impassive expression that made her freeze in her tracks. She screamed that she was calling the police, but the man simply held out a callous hand waiting for her compliance with a look of absolute boredom on his face. "Hand over the keys, miss." This vehicle was purchased with stolen funds. Natalie shrieked in disbelief and looked to our father for help, but he was currently busy begging another officer to let him keep his golf clubs. Stripped of their luxury vehicles and their dignity, they were forced to call a local taxi service that showed up 20 minutes later in a rusted sedan smelling of stale cigarette smoke and cheap air freshener. They piled their few garbage bags of clothes into the trunk and were driven to the outskirts of the city to a roadside motel that was known for its flickering neon sign and questionable clientele. The room they could afford with the cash in their pockets was a cramped space with peeling wallpaper and a carpet that felt sticky underfoot, which was a far cry from the pristine mansion they had abused for so long. Once the heavy door clicked shut on their new reality, the silence did not last for more than a few seconds before the accusations began to fly like shrapnel in the confined space. Dad immediately turned on Mom and blamed her obsession with social climbing for pressuring him into maintaining a lifestyle they clearly could not afford on his legitimate income. He screamed that she was the one who intercepted the mail 3 years ago and convinced him that taking the money was simply claiming what was owed to them as family. Mom screamed back that he was a weak and spineless man who had gambled away their safety net on online poker instead of investing the stolen money into something that could have saved them from this destitution. Natalie sat on the stained bedspread sobbing hysterically because she was realizing that her life of leisure was over, and she blamed both of them for ruining her future by getting caught. The fighting only stopped when the rumble of their empty stomachs forced them to confront the immediate problem of survival in a world where they had burned every bridge. Mom opened her designer wallet to order a comforting dinner, but her face went pale when she counted the crumpled bills and realized they could barely afford 3 meals from a fast food dollar menu. Dad tried to salvage the situation by stepping outside to make a phone call to an old contact at a security firm, hoping to secure a night shift position immediately to pay for the next night at the motel. He returned 10 minutes later looking defeated and gray because the news of the embezzlement lawsuit and the eviction had already circulated through the professional network in Minneapolis. He had been blacklisted from the industry he once worked in, and no reputable company would hire a man accused of stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from his own father. They sat in the dim light of the motel room, listening to the traffic roar past on the highway outside, and realized that for the first time in their lives, they were truly destitute and alone. 2 months later, the scars of that stormy night had finally begun to heal. The silence in Grandfather Edward's sprawling estate was not the heavy or oppressive silence of my parents' house, but rather a peaceful blanket that allowed us to finally breathe without fear of judgment or eviction. Noah was no longer the pale and shivering child gasping for air in the rain, but was now a vibrant boy running through the sunlit gardens with a bright smile that reached his eyes. Every morning when I woke up in a warm bed with the sun streaming through the windows, I had to pinch myself to ensure that the nightmare of the basement was truly over. Grandfather Edward had not only given us a home, but had also restored my dignity by helping me secure a position managing the family's charitable foundation. This work gave me a profound sense of purpose that I had been missing for years because I was now able to help families who were truly in need rather than supporting those who felt entitled to my labor. Life had settled into a comfortable rhythm of school drop-offs, meaningful work, and quiet family dinners where laughter was a welcome guest at the table. However, the ghost of my past life made one final appearance on a crisp Tuesday afternoon when a construction detour forced me to navigate through a run-down industrial district on the edge of the city. I was driving my new car, a safe and reliable sedan that Grandpa had insisted on buying for me, and I felt completely insulated from the grit and grime of the streets outside. As I stopped at a long red light near a row of dilapidated warehouses, my attention was drawn to a commotion on the cracked sidewalk where 2 figures were engaged in a heated screaming match that seemed dangerously close to physical violence. It took my brain a moment to process the familiar contours of their faces beneath the layers of grime and exhaustion, but the realization hit me with a dull thud in the center of my chest. It was my parents standing there in worn-out clothes that hung loosely on their frames, looking decades older than they had just 8 weeks ago. My father was shouting and gesturing wildly with his hands, while my mother stood with her shoulders slumped in defeat, her once immaculate hair pulled back in a messy knot. They were arguing over something trivial, perhaps a few dollars or a direction to turn, but the toxicity radiating between them was exactly the same as it had been in the mansion. They had lost their house, their cars, and their reputation, but they had not lost the bitterness that had poisoned our family for so long. My father looked up as if sensing my gaze, and his eyes locked onto the familiar family crest on the hood of my car before meeting mine through the reinforced glass. The recognition was instantaneous and electric. He nudged my mother violently, interrupting her tirade, and they both rushed toward the curb, waving their arms with a frantic desperation that was pathetic to witness. They were shouting my name and pointing at themselves with pleading expressions that begged for money, a ride, or perhaps just an acknowledgement of their existence. My mother clasped her hands together in a begging motion, a gesture she would have mocked me for only 2 months ago, while my father tried to look authoritative even as he stood in the gutter. For a split second, my foot hovered over the brake pedal as the old conditioning to please them tried to assert itself one last time. I felt a phantom pull to roll down the window and ask if they were okay, to offer them the cash in my purse, to be the dutiful daughter one last time. But then the image of my son convulsing in my arms while they worried about car upholstery flashed through my mind with blinding clarity. I remembered the cold rain, the slammed door, and the absolute indifference they showed when Noah's life hung in the balance. I realized that stopping for them would not be an act of kindness, but an act of self-destruction that would invite the chaos back into the safe haven I had built for my son. I looked at them, not with hatred, but with the detached pity one feels for strangers who have made terrible choices in their lives and must now live with the consequences. The traffic light turned green, and I moved my foot decisively to the accelerator without offering them a smile, a wave, or even a nod of recognition. I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead as the car surged forward, leaving them behind on the cracked pavement with their hands still reached out in empty supplication. I watched them shrink in the rearview mirror until they were nothing but insignificant specks of dust left behind in the exhaust of my new life. Family is defined by action, not blood. This story teaches us that sharing DNA does not automatically grant someone the right to abuse, manipulate, or neglect you. True family consists of the people who stand by you during your darkest storms, who offer you shelter when you are cold, and who prioritize your well-being over their own material possessions. My grandfather proved to be my real family, while my parents proved that they were merely biological relatives. Unchecked greed always leads to destruction. My parents and sister were so consumed by their desire for a lavish lifestyle that they lost their humanity along the way. They believed that money was an infinite resource they were entitled to. And this arrogance blinded them to the reality that their wealth was built on theft and lies. In the end, their greed did not just cost them their house and cars. It cost them the only relationships that could have saved them, leaving them with absolutely nothing. Never compromise your self-worth for toxic people. For years, I allowed my dignity to be trampled because I believed that I owed my parents respect simply because they were my parents. I learned the hard way that you must draw a firm line when people begin to harm you or those you love, regardless of who they are. Walking away from toxic family members is not an act of betrayal. It is a necessary act of survival and self-respect that paves the way for a healthier future. Thank you so much for listening to this emotional journey until the very end. I hope Clara's story inspires you to stand up for yourself and protect the ones you love. What do you think about her decision to drive past her parents in the final scene? Was it too harsh, or was it the justice they deserved? Please share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of justice and redemption.